Now let's join our hearts around the word by coming together in prayer. God, by your Spirit, your word is alive among us. It moves in our hearts. It moves us to action in ways that we do not understand. It gives us courage where we have fear, and it gives clarity where we are cloudy. And so by your Spirit, make this word come alive among us today. In Jesus' name, amen. We're continuing this sermon series in the Gospel of Luke. This section of Luke 5 through 10 where Luke builds relationships with people, builds connections so that there's this foundation for ministry that is carried out in the rest of the gospel. And today we hear these relationships that are forming around the telling of stories. So let's turn our hearts to Luke chapter 7, verses 18 through 23. The disciples of John the Baptist reported all these things to him. There were miracles that Jesus had done. So John summoned 2 of his disciples and sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" When the men had come to him, they said, "John the Baptist has sent us to you to ask, 'Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?'" Jesus had just then cured many people of diseases, plagues, and evil spirits, and had given sight to many who were blind. And he answered them, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them, and blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. On the weekend after Thanksgiving every year, my parents would take me and my 3 siblings to the Clarkston Heights fire station to be present for the arrival of Santa on the big fire truck. And so we would gather with 100 or 200 other kids in the Clarkston Heights. And at first we would wait inside the fire truck garage because it was too cold, although it's always much warmer in Clarkston, I have to say, than up here. But we'd gather in that fire truck garage and we would wait and wait and wait, and the buzz of conversation and laughter would build. And then finally we would hear the siren. And it was off in the distance, and then it would come down the street, and we would all move out into the driveway of the fire station, and we would look, and here comes Santa on top of this fire truck coming down the street, and Santa was waving, and he'd say, "Ho, ho, ho, Merry Christmas." And then when he arrived, we kind of parted like the Red Sea, and the fire truck pulled up into the driveway, and we would wait. And all of these volunteer firefighters were surrounding Santa, and they would drop these paper bags full of peanuts in the shell. I remember this, peanuts in the shell, taffy, and an orange. And every child would get one of these bags. It was my favorite holiday tradition. I have this picture of me being held by Santa. Can you see? And I was not one of those kids that was afraid of Santa. It's like I sensed some kindness in his eyes, and I even let him hold me. And then later, I think we probably got pictures every year with Santa here at the fire station. You can see the fire truck in the background, but this is my whole family minus my dad. I'm on the left, the one with the really stylish glasses. And I was probably in about 4th grade when that picture was taken. It was the same guy who played Santa every year. And I didn't know until probably about this year of my life that the Santa the whole time had been my grandfather. And so my eyes were clouded. I saw what I wanted to see. You know, I only saw Santa. I did not even recognize my own grandfather. I mean, go back a picture, David. You can see his face is very obvious in this photo. If it were your grandfather, wouldn't you recognize him? But no, I needed a little help in identifying this man that I loved. And sometimes that's the case. Sometimes even the people that we're closest to, we don't recognize for who they are. This happened to John the Baptist in the reading today. So John the Baptist, he of all people should have known Jesus' identity. But he sent two of his disciples to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we wait for another?" At this point, just in Luke's gospel alone, we know that John and Jesus have had a lot of contact with each other. For one, Luke is the one gospel that tells the story of the two miraculous births around for John and for Jesus. Their mothers were cousins of some sort, maybe distant cousins, but Mary and Elizabeth knew each other. They had this family relationship. So we assume that John and Jesus knew each other growing up, and they heard the stories of their miraculous births. They were very much aware of each other's identity. And then later in Luke 3, John preaches this whole sermon about Jesus, saying he is the one who is more powerful than I. I am not worthy to untie his sandals. John knew Jesus' identity. So what had happened in the meantime that made John's vision kind of cloudy to the point where he wondered, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we wait for another?" Now we do know, in another part of Luke, Herod sends John to prison. And so it could be that these stressful circumstances in John's life had made him lose sight of who Jesus was. Is Jesus that powerful? If these kinds of things can happen, if the government still is in such disarray? Well, I feel like this passage of Scripture is included for all of us who have a similar struggle sometimes. Oh, we have a relationship with Jesus Christ. Many of us have known Jesus since we were little children. The relationship is there, but sometimes the vision gets cloudy. Are you really that powerful? If you were, why aren't you doing something? Is there really a greater reality going on than just this life? Maybe this is all there is. We have these doubts in our minds, similar to that question that John the Baptist asked. Are you really the one who is to come, or should we wait for another? I love this passage because it makes me feel like I'm understood. Like that experience is not so far outside the human experience that it cannot be redeemed. Well, when these two disciples of John come to Jesus, Jesus could say, well, you go right back and you tell John, my cousin John, oh, you of little faith. I mean, Jesus has used that line, oh, you of little faith, before. He has scolded the disciples when they haven't seen what they needed to see. But in this case, he does not do that. He sends those disciples back having just seen Jesus heal and cast out evil spirits. He sends those disciples back and he says, you go tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind have received their sight. The lame walk. The lepers are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. The poor have good news brought to them. You go tell John what you have seen and heard. The telling of what these disciples have seen will bring clarity to Jesus' identity. A couple of years ago, my family and we traveled to North Carolina. It was a part of my sabbatical trip. It's been over 2 years already. But we went to North Carolina for a worship conference, and then afterwards we went to Kitty Hawk, which is near the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And this is us at this kind of national monument that has been set up for the first flight. And I didn't know a whole lot about the Wright brothers before that, but this park ranger was a wonderful storyteller, and she brought their story alive. She talked about how Orville and Wilbur were these brothers that ran a bike shop in Ohio. They weren't from North Carolina. They were from Ohio, and they had a dream to put a craft in the air. And it was a dream that almost didn't happen. I mean, Wilbur got so sick at one point that Orville had to nurse him back to health. It was maybe a 3-year illness. So it's this heart-wrenching story. And so the time for the first flight came, and they wondered, will today be the day? Because they had tried it many times before. And the conditions were just right. And then Orville said, oh no, we need a picture. We have to have a picture of this flight. And he did have a camera, but he hadn't planned on who was going to snap the picture. He maybe had thought he would do it himself, but he realized both of them were needed to get this thing in the air. So they voluntold this lifeguard that was serving on the shores named John T. Daniels. You are going to be our photographer for the day. Now, John T. Daniels had never before seen a camera in his life. This was 1903. And Orville said, all you need to do, you just need to snap this, push this button, and believe it or not, the picture will take. And this picture was what John T. Daniels captured. And it became this picture that spread all over the world. The event of the first flight itself was miraculous. It was the most exciting thing that had happened technology-wise in that around that time. But the picture itself made it possible for that message that the flight had happened to reach all over the world. It confirmed and advanced the event in a way that the event itself could never have done. The telling of the event was, in a way, even more important than the event itself. This is why Jesus had those disciples go back to John and tell what they had seen and heard. It was ordinary human testimony all along the way that would confirm and advance who Jesus was and what he was doing in the world. The event of Jesus Christ raising from the dead was an event to end all events, but it's the testimony, the telling, that makes that event ours. It makes it a worldwide event for all of us. The other day, actually, last week, I went to David Sedaris, who was speaking downtown at the Bing. David Sedaris is a humor writer, and he's written all kinds of essays for The New Yorker and has books that he's written as well. And he's one of those writers that I think, how in the world does one man have so many funny things happen to him that he can turn it into volumes, you know? I mean, I'd love to have that many funny things happen in my life, but I feel like my life is just a little more ordinary, I guess, than David Sedaris' life. But then he talked about his process just a little bit. He said that every day he sits down and writes 4 or 5 pages. He reflects on what has happened to him and he writes it down. And if he didn't do that every day, intentionally thinking through the events of the day, he wouldn't have any material. Maybe if I did that every day, if I sat down and wrote down 4 or 5 pages, I would have as much material as well. Maybe my sermons would be more interesting. I know a lot of you will say, man, I could write a book about all the funny things my grandkids have said. Or I'm a teacher, and the cute things my kids have said, I should just write a book about it. Well, you could, right? If you were intentional about thinking through every day and writing it down. This is what I think Christians are called to do, not write down 4 or 5 pages every day. Some of us might be called to that. Some of us are writers. But we are called to be intentional about how we see the world. David Sedaris lives with an eye for the telling. He goes through life, he gets on an elevator and thinks, how will I tell about this? He goes through a grocery line to get his, to check out, and he thinks, oh, how could I tell about this? There's an intentionality there, and I think Christians are called to have that heightened awareness and an eye for the telling. Because here's the deal, this is how the gospel works. God relies on ordinary human testimony, and always has. At the end of Luke's gospel, Mary Magdalene sees the risen Jesus, and she is to go back and tell the others. And that's how they find out about it. And then later in Acts, which also is this continuation of Luke's gospel, in Acts, people like Peter and Paul and Barnabas and Timothy and all of these disciples start telling what they have seen and heard. And all of a sudden, whole communities are transformed. Now you might think, oh, I'm not really cut out for that job. I am not a person you want me out there proclaiming the gospel, believe me. I get awkward. I say the wrong things. I don't know my Bible. I get nervous. Actually, not very much happens to me. I've never really seen God at work. I don't have anything to tell. There are all kinds of excuses in our heads that make us want to put proclamation only in the hands of the pastor. But proclamation, telling what we have seen and heard, is something that all of us get to do. And when we are intentional, when we open our eyes to the miracles that we see every day, we are able to say something. What if, when you encountered people at church, maybe in coffee hour or in youth group, instead of saying, hey, how you doing? How was your week? If you used the language of our tradition, where have you seen God at work? Tell me about when you sensed that the Spirit was with you. It would transform our conversations and perhaps give us the hope we needed to be able to see Christ clearly and live out the gospel. The stories that we've been hearing about in worship, people getting up and sharing their testimonies, those are one chance that we have to hear about God at work. But there are so many others. There's an Ignatian practice called the daily examen. And sometimes we hear of a Catholic practice and think, oh no, we're Protestants, we don't need to do that, it's too legalistic, or who knows. But I've found the daily examen to be a great challenge. It's basically like becoming a writer or someone with the eye for the telling. It's where you sit down once a day and you think back on the last 24 hours. and you think, where have I seen God at work in the last 24 hours? Was it at work when you saw someone being kind to another person and kind of transforming a tense situation into something more beautiful? Maybe it was something like you read with a child, and as you were turning the pages with this little person on your lap, you marveled at the wonder of life, and you knew God was present. It doesn't have to be a miracle that you saw, simply that Jesus is at work, acknowledging that wherever you go, God goes. God's already working. We just need to open our eyes. In your bulletin today, you have a little piece of paper. It's green. And I'm going to ask you right after the sermon, just in a moment, to practice the daily examine and write down in the last 24 hours. You can start with, I saw God at work when, and think back on the last 24 hours. When did you see something that made you believe that God is present? It could be something as simple as, I had an argument and then we forgave each other. It can be something like, I looked out my window and I saw the beauty of the rain, and I knew that God does not leave the earth abandoned, but is with us. Anything. Where have you seen God at work? If you need a green sheet of paper, we've got more, and just raise your hand and an usher can bring you another sheet of paper. But go ahead, in these moments, there's going to be some piano music. Use this time as a gift. We don't often get to reflect. God is at work because Jesus is living and active and the Messiah. Where have you seen it?